Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Work Comp Talk. My name is Carmen, your host for the podcast, and joining me today is President of Pacific Workers, Bilal Qasim. And if you haven't heard of yet, our sponsors, Pacific Workers, the Lawyers for Injured Workers, are the #1 workers' comp law firm here in Northern California. And I'm almost going to start saying all of California. So by all means, it doesn't matter if you're in the Central Valley, if you're in Southern California, and you decide that we might be a good fit for you, we have connections all throughout California that we can connect you with great workers' comp attorneys. Check them out at pacificworkers.com, and we'll dive a little bit more into our sponsors, a little bit into our podcast. Thank you for joining us. Subscribe if you have not yet done so on your favorite pod platform. Follow us on social media. You can also follow Pacific Workers everywhere. You can check them out at pacificworkers.com. Scroll all the way to the bottom, and they have all of their social media icons. Click on them, it takes you directly to the pages. So, welcome, Bilal.
Thank you.
We have a different setup today. We thought we'd mix it up for you a little bit. We love mixing it up. We're still trying to find our home for our studio. And I actually like this. As you guys can see behind us, it's the city of Concord. We're live, it's busy, you see cars, it's awesome.
That being said, we love feedback.
Yes.
So if you have constructive criticism for us, we'd love to hear it.
Heck
Whether
yeah.
it's our audio, my makeup,
His makeup.
our background.
I didn't put makeup on him today.
I'm a little shiny, but that's okay. Seriously though, if you guys like what you see, let us know. If you don't, we'd be happy to hear your feedback too.
Heck
We're always
yeah.
trying to improve and do better and create better quality production and value and delivering content to you guys. So we'd love to hear it.
Ultimately, our goal is to just create an atmosphere where we can guide you through a workers' comp case. And even some of the topics that we have discussed throughout the podcast, if you guys have been listening to, you might bump into some of the podcast episodes where it's not necessarily just for workers' comp or injured workers. It's things that could benefit any worker, as a matter of fact. Like when we were talking about the mental health and how much that affects people. It's not just the person that's recently injured. So we might dive into some experts joining us on the podcast, so you're gonna definitely want to subscribe and keep listening because we got a lot of great content coming up. Speaking about comments and everything, we are on TikTok and we love all the feedback that's coming back on TikTok. We recently just had a client reach out to us and talk about something in regards to insurance companies getting credits, and that's what we're going to dive into today in particular. So if that's something that you've had in your head, if that's something that you've heard of, if you're currently going through a workers' comp case and you've heard the term a credit in workers' comp, what does that mean? And that's why Bilal is joining us today to talk all about it.
As lawyers, we hate that word.
Why?
Credit, it's bad stuff in workers' comp.
Yikes.
So a credit is essentially the insurance company saying that they want their money back and or they want to take credit for something that they've given you and applying it towards a future benefit that you haven't received yet.
That sucks because when I was thinking of the word credit, I was thinking something along the lines of I, as the injured worker, am going to get a credit for something that I benefit from. And
No.
it's totally opposite.
Yeah, it's workers' comp. The injured worker doesn't get anything, right?
Damn.
That's news. No, it should be insurance comp, I feel like sometimes, with the way the system's really stacked against people individually, and it's very
Right.
difficult. And it's tough navigating the system, and oftentimes you see the injured worker gets put in predicaments where there are credits that the insurance company is unfortunately legally entitled to.
That sucks.
Yeah, and it comes up a lot in cases, and you'd be surprised how often it does. And
Now-
it can kneecap the injured worker,
Mm-hmm. When would an injured worker going through a workers' comp case see this type of credit? When would this pop up in a case?
It can pop up really at any point in the case, depending on what's going on. There's certain credits that are there for different reasons. Maybe sometimes if you have a personal injury case and you've settled your personal injury case, technically you can't double dip, and so the injured worker would have the insurance company file a petition for credit against them in a workers' comp case to say, hey, you already paid in the personal injury case, why are we paying you in the workers' comp case?
Right, because there's cases where both of them come into play, a personal injury case and a workers' comp case, and they both marry into each other.
Yep.
So that's where it comes to, why would I have a personal injury case and a workers' comp case?
In some cases, the personal injury case can be more lucrative than workers' comp. In workers' comp, it's specifically carved out as an exclusive remedy in lieu of personal injury, just because if you were to go and sue your employer every time you got hurt, high-risk fields like construction, law enforcement, firefighters and such, they'd bankrupt cities and employers because employers do stupid shit all the time, right? So it comes up a lot, but really, because of that, your damages in workers' comp are much more limited than what you could get through personal injury. And so if there's big insurance policy in personal injury, sometimes your case can be worth 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times what you can get in workers' comp.
So they try to kind of brush off their hands and be like, that's not ours.
Exactly. And so it makes kind of sense though, right? Like if you were to sue 2 different people for the same incident, why are you recovering twice?
Yeah.
Right. And so if there's a negligent third party that caused your injury and it's not really the employer's fault, then why should the employer be paying? So the employer will say, hey, you got paid in personal injury, we want our money back. But that's only one instance. There's a lot of other instances in different scenarios where credits are available too.
Right. Okay, so how does the insurance get this type of credit? Does this come out of my pocket? Like, how do they get the credit?
Yeah, so a credit is normally something that they have to put it in kind of layman's terms, to apply for at the court. The insurance company doesn't just get to unilaterally say, you've received money in a personal injury lawsuit, or we've overpaid you in temporary disability, or you've received both EDD, state disability, and temporary disability at the same time, so we want our money back. They don't just get to say that. They have to ask for the court's permission. And they do that by filing a motion with the court, and then a judge has to review whatever the issue is and then decide whether or not they're entitled to the credit.
Have they ever said no to them?
Yeah. And there's a lot of scenarios where they don't get credits. There's a lot of scenarios.
But they try to get them regardless.
They always do. And you'll see a lot of times insurance carriers actually get into trouble because inexperienced adjusters will actually unilaterally go and take credit for things that they're not entitled to, and they just go rogue, and they're not supposed to do that. And they leave the injured worker in a hard place because they cut off benefits or they cut off medical treatment, and they don't announce anything, and it's just, that's it, right? Then they're placed in this, exactly.
We're gonna cut off your credit.
And then all of a sudden the injured worker's like, WTF, like, what happened? I was getting my temporary disability, or I was getting medical treatment, and you just said no. And so
sucks.
It does come up. I think the biggest credit issue is when the insurance company finds out that someone's been working a second job, or
that's a whole nother topic we might be even getting into.
Yeah, basically you're saying, fraud, basically.
Of course. That's double dipping, but in a different aspect. You're not doing it in personal injury. You're getting paid for a job you're doing, and you're getting paid for a job you were supposed to be doing, but you're not doing so. Exactly.
So like if you're on temporary disability and you go start working again because you think, why not? I'm going to collect 2 paychecks. That's not cool. And they'll cut benefits, or they'll file a petition for credit and probably refer you to this attorney for fraud prosecution. But there's other scenarios where it's not so bad. One of them is, if you're deemed permanent and stationary, and while they're waiting for example, a QME report or an AME report for that, they still have to pay you temporary disability. And so there may be an overpayment for the time when you're evaluated to the time that they get the report.
Interesting.
And they're entitled to a credit for that usually, as long as it's in good faith, and it's not, I guess, disproportionately impactful for the injured worker, then usually they'll get a credit for small things like that. But it's case by case.
Right. How does this affect a workers' comp case? How does this affect the injured worker? Like, say they do have to. How does this ultimately come back and play a negative role for the injured worker?
So it depends on what the credit's for. If the credit's for something like receiving a personal injury settlement, well, generally I'll say this. If it's a large credit, it kills the workers' comp case. Because the credits that the insurance companies can get can be applicable to all benefits. Whether it's medical treatment, temporary disability, permanent disability, even attorney's fees, which means the work comp attorney is out of luck, so the credit can be a big deal. But if you've received a huge settlement in personal injury, more than your comp case is worth, then who really cares? It doesn't matter, right? But it does shut down the comp case, because let's say you're getting $500 a week in temporary disability, and you're getting some medications filled and stuff like that, medical treatment, you just got $1 million personal injury payout. That means the credit is going to be applicable for that $1 million if that's what you received after attorney's fees and costs. So you're going to have to burn through all of that before the insurance company in the work comp case would pay another dime.
Damn.
So at that point, what do you do with the comp case? You wait 50 years.
Literally.
So at that point, it's done, right?
Yeah.
If it's a smaller credit, then it may not be as big of a deal. Let's say they overpaid you $2,000 in temporary disability, but now you're permanent stationary, getting ready to settle your case, and you're going to settle your case for $150,000. Well, you negotiate that $2,000 credit or work it in or whatever it is, and it's done. And oftentimes, if you don't want to concede and give the credit, you just ask for more money. So instead of being happy with $150,000, you ask for like $155,000, or whatever it is to eat up the credit, and you can informally kind of negotiate away and resolve it. But it can block out your right to benefits. It can cut off your temporary disability. They can apply temporary disability credits towards permanent disability if given permission by the court. They can sometimes even credit towards future medical care.
That sucks.
Yeah.
It's like a loss. But it's funny that you said sometimes they'll overpay you $2,000. How the F are they gonna sometimes, oops, my bad, I accidentally pay you. Like, that's your fault, not on me.
Sometimes though, so the carrier's responsibility to pay benefits comes into play here. And it makes sense, right? So if you're off of work, all the doctors have been saying you're temporarily disabled, right? You're getting paid temporary disability, but then you're evaluated by a QME or an AME. And 30 days goes by before we get the report. The report comes out and the report says, you know what, Carmen was permanent and stationary the date of the evaluation, which was 30 days ago.
Right.
No one could have known that that was going to happen. And so during that time, the insurance company has to pay you.
Right.
And so they're only doing their job to ensure that you're getting the benefits that you're legally entitled to.
Gotcha. So
versus them being like, hey, you know what? Carmen might be permanent stationary, so let's cut off her TD,
right,
and then we'll wait and see what the report says, and if we're wrong, then we'll retro pay her,
right,
which isn't proper.
Which makes more sense. I'd rather you overpay me than not pay me.
Exactly.
It'd be worse if you didn't pay me.
And then at the same time, the credit would apply towards your permanent disability, which you would have been paid at a lower rate anyway. So it's not like you're out the money. It's kind of just like an accelerated payment in some sense. Right. You're not losing money in that regard.
I mean, I guess that's a good thing. So we've talked about these credits at the insurance companies. If you're just jumping into the podcast, there are credits within workers' compensations. Unfortunately, they don't benefit the injured worker. We just found out through Bilal that they more so benefit the insurance company. When and how does an attorney come in then and battle for me? Like, how do you even fight these type of credits? I know you said you have to file for a motion and then the judge kind of decides. When can you get away with not giving them the credit, and how do you fight for it?
So it really depends on what the scenarios are. And, quite frankly, we've talked very little about credits and stuff. And it's a huge topic, and we could go down the rabbit hole and probably talking about it for hours and hours and hours, and all the different scenarios and types of credits you can get.
Right.
Or the insurance company can get, But really, there's ways to negotiate or fight credits when the situation maybe doesn't warrant the credit. And I think one in particular is with regard to personal injury. The law is designed in a way to not compensate stupid employers. And so to the extent, for example, a personal injury case is settled, but there was employer fault, not just third-party negligence, you can actually argue that the credit should be reduced proportionately to the employer's fault. So that the insurance company for workers' comp doesn't get the entirety of its credit if really it was a combination of stupidity on part of a third party that caused your accident as well as the employer. And so you do what's called
stupidity.
A credit choice.
I mean, just saying, my stupidity can be different to someone else's definition of stupidity. Please define.
Well, there's varying degrees of stupidity. I'm sure most people know that. But, in work comp, there's a couple different standards. There's something called serious and willful misconduct, which is really almost akin to criminal negligence. At least that's how the case law defines it. And that's, essentially that there's a dangerous condition. The employer knew or should have known of the dangerous condition and its likelihood to produce injury. And it was that condition that was left unattended to that really caused your injury. So like if you're using a defectively manufactured saw, and not only is it defectively manufactured, but your employer told you to take the guard off it because it was much more efficient to use the tool that way. So one, you would have a lawsuit against the manufacturer of the saw if it malfunctioned and caused your injury. And two, then if you had the workers' comp case and the employer tried to say, we want a credit for what you received in the personal injury lawsuit against the manufacturer, you could argue back, well, hey, employer, you were also, let's say, 33 or 50% at fault because your negligence caused my injury. then let's say you got $1 million after attorney's fees and costs in the PI case, and you reduce their credit by 50%. Instead of getting $1 million credit, they'd only get a $500,000 credit, which is a tremendous difference for you recovering on the back end. Other types of credits, maybe if they try to allege that they overpaid you in temporary disability because a doctor retroactively found that you're permanent and stationary, a year ago.
Damn, does that happen often?
Sometimes.
Oh,
depends on whether or not you get a good doctor in your case. But there's other scenarios, like if they catch you on sub rosa, which is investigative film, essentially working a job you're not supposed to be working, and you try to negotiate a settlement and hopefully a release, and they promise not to send you to the district attorney for fraud prosecution, or if you're caught exceeding your work restrictions, and so there's a question of during the time they paid you temporary disability, were you really entitled to it because you were malingering or making up or exaggerating your symptoms?
Yeah.
These are all things that we would have to litigate, either by requesting reports from doctors, taking depositions, or ultimately negotiating a settlement, or potentially taking the case to trial on the issue.
Dude, this is like a lot of things that people, I think, don't sit around and think about. They just kind of like, it'll happen to me, it won't happen, that's not gonna happen, but it does.
Yeah, I would say the most common credit that we run into in workers' comp, which there's really not much of a fight about per se, are permanent disability advances. And so when you're getting ready to settle a workers' comp case, a insurance carrier will usually say that they want credit for all permanent disability advances paid during the case.
Of course, they just want credits for everything.
So the law is such that if you're injured and you're not back to work at a new job earning 100% of your pre-injury earnings, or at the same job earning 85% of your pre-injury earnings, the carrier is responsible to start advancing permanent disability if there's a reasonable expectation that you'll have any. And so once temporary disability stop, they're supposed to start paying you the permanent disability advances. Ultimately, though, it's the permanent disability advances that start making up the value of the case. And so let's say you have 50 grand in permanent disability, and you settle out your permanent disability and your medical care, so it's $100,000, and they've paid you $25,000 throughout the duration of your case in advances, they get credit for it. But that's also part of the monetary value of the settlement, so we're not adding that on top. You're not getting it taken away from you, but instead of it being paid at the end, I think to some extent for people it's a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, because they would probably think it should be added on.
Exactly. But we always try and tell people ahead of time, like, hey, look, they're going to start paying you. You're going to get this notice about permanent disability advances. Just know at the end of the day, this really is part of what your settlement is.
Yeah, it's kind of like part of, right? So
yeah,
that sucks. I mean, it sucks for the person that's expecting, I guess, to get more in the outcome. But ultimately, your settlement technically starts from the moment you start receiving benefits. And it all comes back in together at the end.
Exactly. And more specifically, you look at a personal injury lawsuit, right? You don't get crap. The insurance carrier doesn't pay for medical or much, depending on the policy.
For a PI case, like if you got a personal injury
You
case.
may have tons of medical bills out of pocket.
Yikes.
You may have lost wages, for example.
Yeah, you're out of work.
Yeah, what are you going to do? You apply for state disability, maybe you get that, or if you have a short-term or long-term disability policy. But assuming you don't have coverage, no one's there for you in a personal injury case. You're on your own. And so personal injury cases, they tend to see these huge settlements because they're taking into account the past medical bills, the future medical bills, the lost wages.
Makes sense.
All that stuff. Versus work comp, it's kind of like pay as you go, right?
Okay, yeah, that totally
like the insurance company's putting your settlement on layaway.
Oh, that's
like they're kind of like, throughout, they're paying you temporary disability, they're paying for your medical care, they're advancing permanent disability. And so, yes, like, I think the correct way to look at it is kind of like the settlement really is this kind of growing process throughout the case. And I think a lot of people are taken off guard because they're like, well, they get credit for all this stuff. Like, what did you do as my lawyer? They're like, well, we got you all the benefits. We're making sure they're paid at the right rate. The medical treatment's getting authorized.
What do you mean what I got you? You didn't have to pay this shit out of your pocket.
We got you to the doctor who gave you the permanent disability rating in the first place, and we fought over the correct rating and all that stuff. So when it came time to settle the case, even though they're getting credit for certain things, it's a lot of the byproduct of the work that we've done on the case.
And I'm glad you mentioned the whole aspect of having an attorney. What did you do for me? This is having an attorney. What does this credit look like when you don't have an attorney?
I mean, they can railroad you a little bit. I think it's important to know.
A little?
Like, if they said, hey, you settled your PI case and your employer really screwed up and caused your injury, right? And we want a credit for the whole entire personal injury settlement, right? The payout. If you didn't know the fact that their credit can be proportionally reduced by fault, you would, what are you going to do? You're just going to say, okay, I guess.
Yeah, because you don't know.
Yeah, and the judges at the Work Comp Appeals Board are good people, and they do their best to adjudicate cases and ensure that even unrepresented injured workers can go through the system and everything can be fair. They've got so many cases, they've got so much on their plate. I don't think that they can really look out for you the same way
for you in
a
any
lawyer
way. Mm-hmm.
could, and ensure that everything's copacetic.
Yeah. So I guess it just makes sense if this is something, again, we barely scratched the surface on this topic. It's a topic that, I haven't heard. This is the first time that I even hear the fact that they get credits for things that they pay in advance prior to. And I'm pretty sure, like you said, there's rabbit holes we can dive into and continue to talk about this topic. If this is your case, if this is something you're going through, would you highly recommend that's the point where they get an attorney? Don't try to tackle it alone.
Yeah, credits are big issues, especially if it's something where you've been caught working a second job after your injury and while you're collecting temporary disability, or you've got a doctor who retroactively said you're permanent stationary. There's a lot of scenarios that we can fight and really help out on. There's others where we can't. Permanent disability advances, for example, they are what they are. But I think at least going through and sometimes either negotiating the value of the permanent disability rather than the credit and working up the value of the case for you. Those are ways to kind of tackle those issues so that you ultimately net more compensation in your pocket at the end of the day. So
nice.
I would say don't navigate it alone, for sure.
Yeah, and like we've always mentioned, consultations for workers' comp attorneys are free. You don't have to pay for them. If someone is charging you, then go the other way and say, no, thank you. But for the most part, I think you benefit in so many aspects because, Bilal, you've always said this. You studied the law, you know the law, and even then there's still stuff that you're like, what? Imagine the person that never even studied for it and that you're just jumping straight into it. It's obviously you want to have someone on your side, and it's not going to be necessarily your doctor. It's definitely not going to be the insurance company. The only person you could potentially have on your side, if it's a good attorney, is your workers' comp attorney. So you might want to think about it twice. Is there anything we need to dive into that we have not discussed about credits?
I think we covered a lot of it in the most general sense. I can tell you, I can give you stories, I can talk about credits and how much of a nightmare they can be for people, especially when they have bills to pay. And they're being told they're going to have their benefits cut off or the medical treatment cut off. And I think without having the proper advice and having like a sounding board to discuss what your concerns are and stuff, it can be lonely and it can be very difficult and frustrating to deal with on your own.
Imagine not being able to pay your bills and then you don't even know how this come. No, just think about the stress.
I would say if a carrier has told you that you have a credit or they have a credit and you haven't been before the court, they're just unilaterally taking it, that's a really bad place, and I would definitely reach out to a lawyer in that scenario because they're doing something they're not supposed to.
Good to know. Good to know. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up for this episode. We will catch you guys on the next episode of Work Comp Talk. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe if you're watching this video on YouTube. And also follow us everywhere on social media if you like it. Subscribe on your favorite pod platform. We are everywhere. And we always mention, if we're not on your favorite pod platform, let us know so we can submit our podcast to be on that platform as well. We'll catch you guys on the next one, and we'll see you around.